Hello, everybody. It took so long from the intro to me getting up here, you probably forgot who I am. I'm Guy ROSEFELT. I'm Chief Product Officer for SANGFOR International Division. Thank you very much for having me here. I got a question. I have an argument with my peer, my Chief Marketing Officer for Cloud. Let me ask you, we talked a lot about digital transformation, lots of digitalization type stuff. How many people here are actually doing some kind of digital transformation, digitization? Can you raise your hands, please? Like 6, really? Okay. So for those of you that are actually doing some kind of digitalization kind of stuff, my question is, when you talk about these projects internally, do you actually say they're digital transformation things? Do you call them by something else like, I don't know, moving to the cloud? So anybody that actually refers to their project internally as digital transformation or something similar, can you raise your hands? Can I see? Like nobody. Okay, those of you that are doing this, do you actually call it like moving to the cloud or something simple and easy like that? Raise your hands. Yeah, see? That's what I thought. Nobody uses the word digital transformation in their office. I didn't think so. Okay. This is good because this stuff fits in. Yannis's presentation actually feeds in right to what I've got to talk about, which is about why motivation works all the time. We'll talk about some of this stuff over here. The big thing is, I'm going to replace these slides because something Yannis said actually gave me a better thought. With great attack surfaces comes greater advanced persistent threats that take advantage of them, which is why you have reoccurrence of attacks, of breaches and stuff going through. Okay. And the reason for doing this is because, as Yannis was talking about, the attackers are using graphs to figure out how to penetrate systems. They've taken that and then they've automated that using artificial intelligence. So basically the malware, the advanced persistent threats we see today are much, much smarter than any human and mostly much more smarter than any security product out there today. And the reason why we know this is because ransomware is almost 100% successful. Considering that ransomware, every organization has firewalls, endpoint protection, all this other kind of stuff, and yet ransomware still gets through, it shows you that our traditional security thinking doesn't work anymore because malware has gotten smarter. So the reason why this becomes important is when you look at the business impact to ransomware and other successful APT attacks, it affects business because it shuts down your business, it affects your revenue, you have the potential for losing sensitive information, having being posted on the internet, and a whole bunch of other stuff that's out there. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen, and yet it continually does all around the world, even for organizations that have a high level of security maturity. Why does this keep happening? Because the malware gets smarter, the malware gets harder to detect. We spend all our time traditionally saying, you know what, I'm going to buy the best security products that are going to detect and block all the bad stuff. Well, you know what? Malware knows you're going to detect and block, so it does something else. It invades your organization through a bunch of really cool ways, and then it goes to sleep for 5 months. And then it turns itself on. The problem is when you get a suspicious file in your email gateway or through phishing or something, and you try to put it in a sandbox, the malware says, you know what, I'm in a sandbox, I'm going to go to sleep and not turn on, and they're not going to find me. Because it looks for all sorts of things in the sandbox that says, you know what, I'm in a sandbox, I am not running on a live system. And it shuts itself off, becoming very difficult to detect. With these attack surfaces, credentials are a big problem. Credentials can be used then as part of the attack kill chain that allows malware to get into the organization doing what's called initial access. And then from there, they do the privilege escalation, as Yannis said. And this is what's very, very important. This is where the vulnerabilities become an issue. If you don't patch, these vulnerabilities exist, and malware will take advantage of it because they have all these different ways of coming into your organization very, very successfully. Now, how many people know the MITRE attack model? Anybody here seen the MITRE attack model? Yes? Okay, so this is really cool because what MITRE did is they went and looked at all the campaigns that have been known, all the threat actors that have been known, mapped out the tips and techniques and procedures they use on how to invade your organization. And they've done a really good job of mapping out things like what is the first stage, which is going to be initial access. And how do they get in through initial access? They get in through something like a public-facing application, web applications, or RDP, or something that's out there, or as what happened with Colonial Pipeline a couple of years ago, a old SSL VPN credential that nobody had gotten rid of. Oh, hello, wrong button. Once you get into the organization, then you now do privilege escalation using a whole bunch of different techniques. One of the most common ones and most interesting is called privilege escalation, where what they can do, or process injection, where what they will do is they will basically take the malware code, squirt it into memory, into a running existing process, and your system doesn't know any better, and then malware does all sorts of bad things by taking over your system. There are hundreds of vulnerabilities that can be exploited at any given time of day, no matter when and where you are, because someone hasn't patched something somewhere. You could have the best patch system in the world, but if your patch system only patches every few systems, every so often, there's always going to be some measure of vulnerability available in your environment at any given time that can be exploited. So when you look at initial access, most of them come through browser vulnerabilities, for example, and these are some of the most common vulnerabilities that are out there. Our SANGFOR Farside operations team discovered that you would actually see a lot of vulnerabilities in Apple technology that can also be exploited by malware. You don't hear about it very often, but it does exist. By the way, I'm trying to get to the highlights of this presentation. This presentation is actually 3 times longer than I'm showing you up here because it's got lots and lots of really cool technical detail. If you guys want to hear more about it later on, come and talk to me and my colleagues after the fact, and we'll be able to go into more detail about this stuff. But again, initial access takes advantage of the vulnerabilities and how it can go and exploit the system to be able to insert itself and then be able to grow. When we do privilege escalation, the malware is in your environment. It has already breached you. All right, now it sits around and does nothing and waits until it figures out a good time to go do something. And then it says, I'm going to find a vulnerability on my list. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a process injection where I'm going to take over some vulnerable piece of software and I'm going to masquerade as that process running on your system. And again, the most common exploited Windows vulnerabilities that are used for process injection, how they squirt themselves into your system. And then from our standpoint, we've seen a lot of things happening on Microsoft Exchange servers, and email is a great way to take over a system and then from there expand out into your organization. Now, there are lots of different techniques that are being used by advanced persistent threats to get into your organization, bringing your own binary, or basically they bring their own malware binaries, masquerade, inject them through phishing and some other kinds of stuff. Living off the land, where basically they will take an existing Windows process and they will pretend that they are an existing Windows process and they will then take over your system. They do communications anti-tracing, where they will communicate to command and control servers in a very covert manner, so it's very difficult for the tools that you have, whether it's a SIM, whether it's NDR, for other kinds of stuff, to be able to detect when these communications happen. So you don't even know that you're infected. You don't know that the malware is talking to a command and control server on the internet, getting ready to download more payloads to do bad things, or exfiltrating data, because your tools cannot see them now. Finally, these tools have gotten very, very smart. This malware now has operational security capability. It looks at the environment that it's in, learning from how to avoid being in a sandbox, and it can now look at all the security tools on your systems and say, I can circumvent them, and if I can't circumvent them, I'll just go to sleep so you will never know that I'm here. So you will never detect the malware that's sitting on there, and it'll just wait for 6 months, 12 months for a trigger, and then it'll turn back on again. Now, there's a whole bunch of different techniques. I'm not going to go into all of them. I want to give you a couple of representative things here. Is when I talk about bring your own binary, this one's actually really cool because what happens here is an attacker is able to download through phishing or some other tool a malicious DLL that replaces an existing DLL on your system. All right, and then what happens is once this DLL is run, it does something really, really cool. you have an existing process that's being run by something, say Windows Notepad. And then all of a sudden, what this malware does when you run it is it will freeze the process for Windows Notepad. And then it will go into memory where the Windows Notepad operation exists, and it will actually carve out a portion of the code that's in there, delete it, and then replace it with its own malicious code, turn the process back on, and go. The problem is all your security software that's on there now is looking at the process that's running, which was already validated because when it was started by Windows Notepad, that is a valid Windows application. So as they keep checking on that process, it was started by a valid application. Your security software has no knowledge of the fact that the code that's in memory was replaced by something bad, and it allows the code to do some bad stuff in there. Really, really cool stuff. Living off the land uses existing binaries from your operating system, from applications to be able to do bad stuff. My personal favorite one right here is there is a script that exists today called Defeat Defender that basically goes out and looks at, using the tools that it has in your environment on Windows, can actually disable Windows Defender software. So it is no longer protecting your system. And more importantly, it does it in a manner that you do not know it was ever disabled. So what the malware does, it disables the software, it goes to sleep, 2 weeks, wakes up, and checks to see if you guys figured out the Defender had been shut off. If it got turned back on, then the malware goes to sleep and says, okay, these guys know what they're doing, I don't care anymore, and I'll just basically sleep for the rest of my life. If it turns back on, discovers that you guys had not discovered that Defender had been shut off, it then turns on and does a whole bunch of really bad things because it now knows it is safe to do so because the security is turned off. Windows Defender is just one of other kinds of security software of AV, of EPP, all kinds of endpoint protection that can be disabled through AI-enabled malware. So, an interesting example of this is SolarWinds. How do people know what SolarWinds is, right? How do people use SolarWinds? I feel sorry for you guys. Okay, so what happened for SolarWinds was is really straightforward. The attackers got into the SolarWinds code repository and replaced a key file, key DLL, with a malicious one so that when SolarWinds found an update, the malicious file went out with them. The big thing that happens is because, again, the malicious DLL is being called by a valid SolarWinds application, as far as security software running is concerned, the DLL must be valid because it was called by a valid application. The malware runs, it then goes out and does some really cool things before it decides to continue. I'll talk about that in just a second. But once it runs, it then goes out and says, I'm going to go out and find my command and control server. I'm going to tell it I'm here. The command and control server is going to download, or tell me to download a bunch more stuff, more payloads, which I am then going to deploy so I can then propagate throughout the environment and take over your systems and exfiltrate data. And all this happens once SolarWinds attack is validated in terms of the environment, takes place in less than 45 minutes. And it can basically take over your entire environment. That's pretty cool. So this is just to show you right here, if you actually looked at the process running, Windows will tell you this is a valid process because, again, it was started by a valid signed application run by SolarWinds. Now, this is the cool part. This is a 9-step checklist that the SolarWinds attacker used to validate the environment. It looked to see what domain it was in. It was in a non-Russian domain. If it was in a Russian or Russian supporting domain, it shut off and didn't care. If it was in a non-Russian domain, it said, okay, let's go to the next step and then determine whether or not I can set the DLL time to a future time to see if anybody's going to notice so that I can test it out and make sure that no one's going to catch it when it runs. And then it goes through several other steps that are in here, and you can look at this on the full presentation. But the point being is, the artificial intelligence that uses graph stuff on this APT is so sophisticated, it will go through each one of these steps over a period of a couple of weeks. And if it fails any one of those steps, it goes to sleep forever and doesn't care. The minute it passed all 9 of those steps, it then turns on and does really bad things. And this was 3 years ago. Imagine how sophisticated artificial intelligent malware is today. All right? So what you need to do is you need to start using artificial intelligence to fight artificial intelligence. That's the only way to go do this. And there are many different kinds of techniques you can use to have your security software, if it's AI enabled, to be able to do this. I can build baselines of my behavior and look for anomalous behavior that goes against the baseline. Right? A person comes to work and they use their browser and SSL from 9 to 5 every day, and then they go home and nothing happens, and all of a sudden this computer starts sending stuff out on HTTPS at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday in these big bursts. That's an anomaly. I can look from a threat perspective where if I see a bunch of anomalies that are happening in there, can the anomalies point to other anomalies? So for example, one of the things that they use is a thing called domain-generated algorithm, where when they exfiltrate data, they will generate thousands and thousands of domain requests that go to an invalid domain. But what happens is the host part of that domain request is a little tiny snippet of data they're trying to exfiltrate. And then it goes out to the command and control server, to DNS, and the DNS server that it's supposed to belong to says, I don't have this address. And of course, it sends a rejection back, so it keeps sending more DNS requests. In the meantime, that fake DNS server is taking all the requests and then reassembling all the data, which is really, really cool. Why this becomes important is if I look at these tens of thousands of DNS requests that are coming through and I resolve them, they resolve back to 1 or maybe 2 or 3 IP addresses, which shows me from an anomaly perspective that all these bad things can lead to a bad threat actor somewhere along in there. And then the last part is, from a lateral view, is I can use correlation of different activity in my environment at a higher level to say, do I see bad things happening? So I may be infected, the malware goes to sleep for like 2 or 3 weeks, it goes out and pulses the command and server once or twice a month. Can I look at this behavior and track low and slow behavior looking for bad things that happen? The point being is, most of the tools that you have in your environment today cannot do this. A SIM cannot do this because it isn't really designed to do that. It's not designed to look for long-term, very slow intermittent behavior. So you need to have purpose-built artificial intelligence modules that look for very specific kind of things. Do I look for bursty HTTPS traffic? I don't need to decrypt the traffic. I just need to be able to look at the HTTPS behavior and see, is it doing things that you would not normally see a web browser do, or communications going to someplace? Am I seeing a bunch of DNS requests being generated by 1 or 2 boxes by the thousands, once or twice a week for about 4 or 5 minutes, and looking for the kinds of stuff? There is a lot of very, very specialized behavior that artificially intelligent malware uses today to do bad things. But you have to have an AI-enabled security product to be able to start looking at that behavior over the longer term and correlate the different behaviors together to be able to find the bad things. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is an example. We had a customer that did this. This was a smart car parts manufacturer. And one of the problems that they were having was they were coming out with new technologies, and yet their competitors were coming out with the exact same technologies either before or at the same time. And they couldn't figure out why. We came in and did an analysis, and the analysis showed that there was a R&D director's system that was infected by malware that went out, laterally pushed out to all the other systems out there, and then had those other systems basically send all the proprietary data to this one R&D manager's laptop, which then went out and every couple of weeks would send out huge bursts of traffic for a few minutes to be able to exfiltrate all this data. But it's very difficult to detect this using a SIM and other kinds of technologies. So you had to have tools that could actually watch this behavior for a period of time to be able to determine that this was actually happening. All right, so the takeaway for all this is, and again, this was the highlighted fast version. There's a whole bunch more detail in my presentation if you want to see more about this. But the big things are, as Yana said, attackers are using graphs because they're smarter, and if you can automate the graphs using artificial intelligence, it becomes way, way smarter, which is why this stuff is so successful, right? But the only way you're going to be able to do this right now is to be able to combat these malware-enabled, AI-enabled malware that exploit all these attack surfaces, is to do it with AI. So you need to start thinking about what tools you have that can be upgraded or replaced or can be complemented with AI-related tools to be able to look for this kind of stuff. All right? And then more importantly, you want to work with a partner, you want to work with a vendor that has experience in looking for these kind of things. Because not all vendors, not all partners necessarily understand how AI is doing all this kind of stuff. This has become a very specialized thing in the last couple of years. So it's still pretty new to most people. And to most vendors and to most partners, okay? But this is where the world is going. The malware, advanced persistent threats are going to be getting smarter. And it's going to be harder to defend against them because they can hide better. They can turn themselves off. They don't have to do it today or tomorrow. They can do it in 6 months. They can wait until Christmas time and turn on Christmas Day by a trigger. So you need to be able to have ways of looking for the breadcrumbs that could potentially indicate that you've already been breached. Most important thing is detect and block and prevent doesn't work anymore. That is best effort. All right? You have to assume today that you've already been breached. And now you have to have the tools in place that use AI to go back and do the threat hunting, looking for the stuff that's out there. All right? And with that, thank you very much. Appreciate the time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.